This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breach Burke. Today's subject, we're going to continue our foray a bit into Slavic folklore and what we might think of as Slavic mythology. And we're going to talk about the Rusalka, or the Rusalki, I think is the plural of that. And the Rusalki are a very interesting group of beings. I guess you would call them, they would technically fall into the realm of fairy beings or fairy-type beings, elemental beings. And they're interesting in the sense that they're the definition of what they are, or at least the inflection regarding what they are, changes over time. Now, the original Rusalki are supposed to be a type of, they're either considered to be a forest spirit or a water spirit. Almost, it seems in most cases, even if they're forest spirits, they're still associated with water in some fashion. It says here, just reading from general article on them, it says specifics pertaining to Rusalki, differed among different regions. In most tales, they live without men. In stories from the Ukraine, they were often linked to water. In Belarus, they were linked with forest and field. And they were usually pictured as beautiful naked maidens, but in some areas, they were imagined as hideous and hairy. Not necessarily unusual for when you're talking about nature spirits, because there's that element of both. When we talk about the Chtonic or the earthly in that sense, you're talking about something. I mean, we look at the beauty of nature, but nature also we think of as, kind of being dirty and wild and filthy, and, which depending on how we experience that. And I love this. They're said to tickle men to death. We'll talk a little bit about that particular aspect of their personality. According to some Russian beliefs, Rusalki had the appearance of pale girls with green hair and long arms. And in fact, it's been said that the riverbanks, when they, with their lush green, are supposed to be the Rusalki laying their green hair to dry on the riverbanks. At least that's one story that's been heard. In other beliefs, they're described as naked girls with light brown hair. In Poland and the Czech Republic, the water Rusalki were younger and fair-haired, while forest ones looked more mature and had black hair. But in both cases, if you looked up close, the hair turned green and the faces became distorted. If you caught sight of Rusalki dancing by the water, then you would typically, if they saw you, you would be forced to participate in their dance until you died. So there's, there are several other entities that are, comparable to the Rusalki in Russian folklore and elsewhere. In Russian folklore, they tend to be, I believe they're associated with water there as well. And okay, so what happens is initially we're talking about a type of being that is what they call a wight, W-I-G-H-T, fertility wight, which is like a spirit, or this is described as a spirit, ghost, or other supernatural being. Again, an elemental being that passed water to the crops and fields. Okay, so this was their kind of association with both. And so really they were in many ways, I mean, yes, they're said to be tricksters. It's worth noting that even though they are often considered to be water spirits or associated with water, they don't, they're not, okay, they have legs, okay? They're not fish creatures. They can climb trees, okay, which might be also part of their forest association. And I note that specifically because as of the 19th century, we start to see a change in the way the Rusalki are perceived. And at least one of those perceptions is as a mermaid. In fact, if you are familiar with Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid, which of course has been made into a number of things, including a Disney film, the Little Mermaid is based on a story of a Rusalka. Okay, that is, although it's said that Andersen himself was inspired by a work entitled Undine. Now, Undine is another name for a water spirit. Okay. And the interesting idea there is the idea that these are spirits of water that are soulless and that are seeking an immortal soul. And oftentimes this is found through love. Okay, so there's that idea of the Little Mermaid tale of falling in love with the human prince, and then going through all kinds of magical machinations. What I found interesting about the Little Mermaid story is the fact that the mermaid, whatever name she goes by, in these different stories, and also, by the way, in Dvořák's opera called Rusalka, which has it's very similar to the same plot as Andersen's Little Mermaid, although in the opera, there's that betrayal. The mermaid becomes human. Because she's in love with the prince, but then the prince, rejects her, sends her away, doesn't marry her. In the opera version, she, there is a similarity to the original Andersen fairy tale in that she's offered a dagger, that if she kills him, she can regain her mermaid form, but she refuses to do that, so she ends up dying and turning into either sea foam. How often have we heard about sea foam in the dark feminine, right? But also into the will-o'-the-wisp, which is that little ball of light that kind of bobs and weaves through the woods. I mean, that we generally associate with marsh gases and things like that in a more scientific sense. But the will-o'-the-wisp was considered to be a kind of, a dangerous kind of fairy air spirit that was a light through the forest, but it often led you into danger or to death. Okay, that was the superstition or the folklore surrounding the will-o'-the-wisp. And so, but in the opera version, the prince... he gets angry at his new foreign bride, and instead he decides to go back and look for the Rusalka, and she, and the thing is, and he wants to, and he recognizes her, and she's able to speak to him because, of course, in all the versions she's mute and can't talk. She gives up her voice in exchange for her humanness. So, and again, that I should just throw in there that has often made this Rusalka association with the sirens, who were these monstrous creatures with these beautiful, who looked half like appealing women and half like these fish forms or these monstrous forms that but had a voice that could lure you to your death. Okay, so you see the similarity there. At the end of the opera, what happens instead is the prince decides he wants to stay with the Rusalka, so he kisses her, but the kiss, of course, means a watery death for him. So there's all kinds of there's this variation here of the water spirit that falls in love, is initially the object of her affection, shows an interest, but ultimately she's more of the the woman who one has an interest in playing around with, not the one that someone has an interest in marrying. Okay, and so because again, by this stage we have this sort of chivalric notion of love and marriage rather than the traditional. Although the prince, in at least in the one, is in an arranged marriage, so there's this idea that one is in love with their spouse, which now we kind of take that idea for granted now. That wasn't really always the way of marriage, especially when you're talking about royalty. Okay, the idea was that you married the person who provided you with the most convenient position in society. So of course, if you look at the elements of this water spirit who provides an attraction or a sensual kind of allure, this would be something separate from the idea of what one would think about in respectable marriage, or the kind of marriage that that gives one their proper place in a civilized society. And speaking of such things, one of the things I thought it was interesting was that at least in some folklores, it might be in Poland, I might be corrected on that, but there's at least one place where the Rusalka are seen as women with hair that's long and unbound, like unbraided, and wearing these like white shifts, like dresses, but with no belt. And it was noted that both belts and braiding were signs of a civilization, like a woman who is civilized because she's constrained or bound by that belt, or her hair is bound in some way. So the Rusalka, being with everything, no belt, no braiding of their hair, they were considered to be very, very wild. And infrequently, they're also shown as being naked, running naked through the woods, which again is that idea of that that wildness, that feralness of nature. Now, okay, so we have the Little Mermaid story, which is worth mentioning because that was, at least in Dvořák's sense, that particular being, mermaid being, was interpreted as a Rusalka. However, again, as we see this was not the original thing. Rusalka had legs; they could climb trees. They were not naturally mermaids in their original form. Now, it's noted here that their benevolent portrayal, because generally they were considered to be nature spirits that assisted in the fertility of the crops in particular, by providing water, because water is needed to nourish and create life. What happens instead after the 19th century, obviously we see these representations in fairy tales and in the opera, but it says here their benevolent portrayal changed when the myth changed to reflect a more cynical and malevolent world. And I should also note at the 19th century, this is when we're at the height of rationalism, okay? And we are getting ready to move into society that is industrialized. And also, specifically within the context of Slavic paganism, or Slavic Christianity, we should say, as I've noted in previous podcasts on Slavic figures in folklore and in what you might think of as myth, as Johanna and I had discussed, the term mythologies, it doesn't quite mean the same thing when we're talking about Slavic folktales or folk creatures. But it's been noted that Christianity has always had a harder time getting a foothold in a lot of places, especially Russia. In Ukraine, I think there was a great effort of the church to Christianize around Kyiv and around those areas, but other areas, and it was also noted that frequently, regardless of what part of what we think of now as Eastern Europe that you're talking about, that there was a frequent. If the Christian church would have seen it as a quote unquote backsliding, but there was a dropping of Christianity and going back to the pagan ways. This is one of the areas where Christianity, even though it may have been introduced probably around the 800s CE, and maybe was more established by the 1200s, it really did not. It didn't have the same foothold. And then, of course, by the 20th century, you see these forays back into the ancient religion. That are being, you're seeing, even though you, again, like in other places in the world, you'll have this Christianization of the rites. So with regard to the Rusalka, in particular, there's supposed to be one tradition at Pentecost of throwing garlands to the riverbeds for the Rusalki. So again, there's this association with Easter and post-Easter. So you're seeing this combination of customs here, but there is an attempt now. You do see, and again, Joanna and I have talked about this. That now you're seeing in the 20th and 21st century there is kind of this return to the ancient religion. It's not so much about that Christianization never really took a full hold. So anyway, my point in bringing that up is that you have these two images of the Rusalki, and this other image, the Rusalki were considered to be unclean. They were thought the Rusalki was either a spirit of a woman who had drowned in a body of water, either way by suicide or murder. So that makes her akin to that restless dead or that vengeful dead. Also, the Rusalki were associated with women who were who died unbaptized, and in some cases I've also read died as virgins, which again puts them in the same class as what we talked about with the Greek aori, these women who did not fulfill their role or their Christian duty in some fashion, become these nature spirits that they're not regarded as beneficent, they're regarded as malevolent. And one of their functions is to try to either drown men by dragging them to their death. There's still, I think, the tickling to death motif that's in there. In all the cases, we're talking about the Rusalki as spirits of death. They have that. Weirdly, they have that anima quality, because we've talked about the anima as Jung's representation of the soul, right? But literally, these are supposed to be women who don't have souls. So that gets us to the distinction between soul and spirit. That's often talked about. Not everybody agrees on which of those terms you want to is the accurate one, I guess. But I think about what James Hillman says in The Dream in the Underworld, where he talks about anima and pneuma. Okay, one implying anima, implying the soul, and pneuma implying what we think of as spirit, what we might associate, say, with, the Holy Spirit, or this idea of giving up the earthly desires for spirit. That's pneuma in that sense. It's this idea of something that rises above, that's something pure of, earthly desire and carnal desire. And you see it in these stories where you have somebody who, you'll see this in Faust to some degree as well. There's almost this idea that true love, that a man's true love of a woman, okay, or a woman's, or vice versa, that true love for a man is going to be something that that is essential to your immortal soul, like that, like there's a connection there. Now it's funny because to that point, Hans Christian Andersen's version of The Little Mermaid, in his version at the end, the mermaid, she can't bring herself to kill the prince because, her sisters give her a dagger and they say, you could kill him and go back to your mermaid form. She doesn't do that, but instead what she finds is she becomes a spirit of the air, and through 300 years of good works, she can become an immortal soul and go to heaven, okay? Obviously very, very Christianized there. But Andersen says about this specifically when he writes about this text is he just says, I just can't believe that, that falling in love with somebody is what's gonna somehow give you your ticket to heaven. He says that seems stupid to him. So he was preferred the idea that there was, again, that there was something kind of, beyond that there had to be some connection to, benevolent love of humankind or something. Again, we talk about these different types of love. We talk about the profane love versus something like what you Christians think of as agape, which is more like the ideal of platonic love and things like that. The love of brotherhood of your fellow, humans and so forth. But again, there's this idea that one's emotions, okay, and so we're talking about emotions with respect to water spirits now in particular, and we know that the water and the emotions tend to be connected to each other. You have these water spirits, so you have this idea that that's true, that kind of true deep love that comes from what Jung would call the projection of the anima or the animus, that way that you see your ideal in that person and you fall for that person regardless of what that person is. Okay. And that this is somehow the ticket to spirit. And it's an interesting idea because what we actually see in a lot of these is just the opposite. There's the idea of the suppression of the soul in favor of spirit. Although to a certain degree, you might argue that that's exactly what these stories are meant to be, somewhat didactic or cautionary tales. Like, you should stay in your lane. You should follow, the accepted social model of things, or else this is how you're going to end up. You're going to end up in this terrible situation. It's going to bring you nothing but sorrow and destruction. You're not going to be able to go to heaven or whatever. It's there's this. And then of course when you start to associate the Rusalki with unbaptized women. It's this idea that you become this kind of wild or feral spirit, again, tied to the earth. Because remember, in this way of thinking, earthly life is an appalling kind of suffering or an imperfection that needs to be transcended. Okay, that's why so much of Western religion is geared towards, focus on the next life and don't worry about, the more you suffer in this life and do penance, the better your life's going to be in another place. And you, in fact, even see this in the original Little Mermaid, where she is, every time she dances, it's like she's, being stabbed in the feet. And, there's, in other words, and she loses her voice. So she has all this suffering. She can't, in other words, the price of being human is to suffer. Okay. And I do think it's interesting, though, that she feels like as she dances, her feet are being stabbed with knives or, with sharp objects. Because if we think about the symbolism of the sword, at least one aspect of the sword, perhaps this is just me as a tarot reader, but, swords have to do with the intellect. Okay, they have to do with the mind. And I would argue that actually most of the thing that makes us suffer as humans is the mind. The way, not so much the fact that we can think, but the fact that we can think and overthink and ruminate and dwell on the past and worry about the future. This is where we spend most of our time suffering. And our perceptions of other things. We don't actually live in the moment in the world. Everything, if we have a feeling about something, a million thoughts come rushing in to plague us with doubt. So the idea that as she dances, which is a very natural kind of ecstatic thing, she's being stabbed in the feet by swords. Okay, to me that's almost like metaphorical of like that onrush of thoughts that can come into your head. So interesting choice of symbolism there, certainly, as these kinds of works were being written. Another association of the Rusalka, I should mention, is that they are associated with protecting the rye fields of Baba Yaga. Okay, now Baba Yaga, we've did a podcast on a while ago. In fact, that was the first joint. Occasionally I'll do a joint podcast that is not a Chthonia conversation, and the first one I ever did was with Joanna Madlock, and it was on Baba Yaga. And it's the Baba Yaga story is, she's obviously, she's, as we had discussed in that podcast, she has all of the elements of a natural being, which is, people could say it has both good and evil. I would just say it's not that they're particularly one or the other. It really does depend on the circumstance. With a lot of things, it depends on, with a lot, when we talk about elemental energy, a lot of it has to do with how it's used. On a hot day, it's nice to feel a gentle breeze, but if a hurricane, knocks your power out and, drops tree branches into your house and, puts a hole in your roof, then we can see that wind can be very destructive. Or if you're a sailor, certainly, or you work on, your work involves working on the high seas in some way, you're certainly very well aware of the beneficent or not so beneficent aspect of the wind or the air. Fire is the one that we classically use. Fire is what we use to keep warm. Fire is what you use to to cook food. Fire has many uses that are helpful. And fire can burn things up that, we need to get rid of. But fire also can be destructive in the sense that it burns things down and, and scorches the earth. So, and you can go through this with all the elements, right? So Baba Yaga, like a lot of these, she's this very, this elemental kind of a force herself. She is the force of a witch. So remember, that's our dark feminine type that has to do with the woman with knowledge of the earth, like the witch woman who has knowledge of the earth. And as we see in the stories of her, which tend to, again, be these sort of didactic tales, those who show her respect and honor what she wants them to do are rewarded. Those who are lazy and shiftless and expect her to just, give, are decidedly not rewarded. Okay. And, but she's supposed to have iron teeth and, supposedly she eats children, she cannibalizes. Again, there's all of these elements around the dark and devouring feminine and what we fear about that aspect of femininity. So to make the Rusalki, kind of part of her, legion of guardians, I guess you might say, of Baba Yaga, is to put them again in that realm that is, that witchy kind of a realm. And the fact that they're shapeshifters as well, that makes them liminal creatures. And we do know that liminality tends to play a big role when dealing with what we'll say are, I don't even like to use the word boundaries, but when we think about constructs of masculine and feminine, frequently, especially in society, the problem that we have a problem with liminality in those categories. We see it now. You see problems now, say, with the LGBTQ IA plus community is running into these problems because to get outside of what we call heteronormative roles is to upset that traditional social idea of masculine and feminine. Okay, what we now call cisgender or whatever. There's this idea of it's not just man to woman or woman to man. It's now there's a fluidity there that makes people uncomfortable, and it ends up being associated with this. So I always count that kind of stuff in, even though, and again, even to use the word dark, and I've said it before, technically femininity and masculinity are neither dark nor light, okay? I use the term dark more in the sense of that which is hidden, obscured, or feared because not a whole lot is known about it. So in that sense, I talk about this as being dark, and that's what's uncomfortable for people who, feel that one should, obey these particular, again, to use an older term, heteronormative ideas. That when you step outside of those, somehow you are inviting that fairy world in, or you're inviting the other world in. We talk about conceptions of Samhain, what we think of now as Halloween. And at least one of the practices was that, you would have these role reversals. You'd have men that dress up as women. You have women that dress up as men. Okay. There's the idea that this dichotomy that is really very, very Roman. And when I talk about Roman, I mean ancient Roman. I mean, it was definitely, certainly within language constructs. All languages have masculine, feminine, and neuter. We see in Latin particularly where people could take masculine words and feminize them, or vice versa, if they're referring to, a feminine form of that otherwise masculine term, like Deus. Okay, Deus means God. Okay, if you're referring to a female deity, they would refer to her Dea, D-E-A. They would add the feminine ending instead. That's just one example. But this idea of, that everything has to kind of be in its gendered order, that's something that is that's in our culture that we have a hard time negotiating. So that liminality. So again, the Rusalki are, they're in being out in the forests and being out in the waters. This association, like I said, you frequently see them climbing trees and out in nature and dancing naked and doing all of these things. They're living out on that boundary, on that wild boundary. And there's always a fear that if you disrupt those specific categories, including the masculine, feminine ones, that somehow you are going to disrupt the order of the world and that things are going to be thrown into chaos and disorder. And unconsciously, that's the thing that people are afraid of. Now, truthfully, there's nothing really wrong with things occasionally going into chaos and disorder. That's not, we assume everything has to be orderly and structured all the time, and that isn't necessarily the case. In fact, some of us could do with a little more disorder, but we fear it because the outcome of it is uncertain. We like to know, we like structure, control, and outcome, and that's why we like ideas of salvation because, and this spirit idea appeals to us because we say, well, we're working towards something. We're working towards some kind of a goal that we know is going to give us this good result in the end. And of course, the fact remains that actually that's not the case at all. I mean, we don't actually know that. But we like to have some of those assurances. But ironically, we've lost the ability to see the signposts because our intellect has taken over so much. Okay, anyway, I'm kind of waxing philosophical about that. But that difference between soul and spirit is, I think, important here because we're talking about the Rusalka as something that has no soul, okay? But at the same time, at least in Jungian terms, is almost the very definition, of the soul. The beautiful woman who is almost like this fantasy or otherworldly kind of woman who, for the human man is often a kind of, ideal that cannot be easily attained. And that often is projected onto other human women, but human women cannot live up to that because it's an ideal. It's an archetype. It's a collection of qualities or aspects that we really can't define consciously, but we know it when we see it. Okay, and this kind of indulgence in the soul that's something that, religion has told us to stay away from. In fact, in Hillman's book, that's what he says. When you exchange soul for spirit, the idea is that now you alienate yourself from nature and from earthly life and from the underworld, which now has become a place. He talks about the harrowing of hell. Christ goes down to hell to liberate people. But he says, so there's no need to experience death again. It's like, well, that's a problem, actually. You need to have that katabasis. You need to have that underworld journey to really fully be human. So I don't know. It's just interesting because, we see this kind of a thing, and it's interesting how love in a lot of these stories is portrayed as a kind of katabasis, like the thing that will drag you through. But as we know, love can be wonderful and it can be painful. So anyway, I just find the interest, that these Rusalki, which tend to be these kind of liminal anima figures in their own way, they're also kind of viewed as soulless because they're not embodiments of that immortal spirit that people talk about, that static immortal spirit. So it's interesting. Also, furthermore, here we as you see this shift in thinking about Rusalki as being these restless spirits, like turning them into the idea of the wronged woman, or the woman who is unbaptized, or the woman who is a virgin who dies before those things could happen. They take on a malevolent characteristic, and it's they're not considered to be child stealers or anything like that. That is another class of what they would call a damned or condemned being. Okay. But it shows how these spirits of earth and of nature go from being these benevolent forces that fertilize the field and the crops, as we move towards a more industrialized area, as we see this struggle of Christianity to take a hold in the Slavic countries, and as we see this move towards industrialization. I've talked about this. These movements in this direction, how they devalue the earth and they devalue the feminine. And here's a good folkloric example of it, because now she's not a beneficent spirit. The Rusalki is a bringer of, is that feminine seductress who's a bringer of death, who represents this what's wild and what's outside the civilized bounds of Christianity and of what the woman's, appropriate role is in society, and may even to a certain degree be a little poke at the suffering of love, because she's, I don't know. It depends on the intentions of the writers of these things. I'm not convinced that either Dvořák or Andersen was, they have this kind of Christian inflection to things, but at the same time, I don't know that in these kinds of situations that kind of love is always encouraged. Okay, there's not always an encouragement of choosing your own partner or choosing the person you love. How many tales have we heard of, the rich, aristocratic woman who falls in love with the hired help, and so then somebody goes out and has the hired help killed, or thwarts the thing because that person's not good enough for you to marry. That kind of motif that we see. And so I don't know that in in those kind of quote unquote civilized circles that the idea of marrying the person you love was necessarily, yes, you do have chivalrous ideas, but I don't know that it was necessarily, always the aim of the person, who was getting married. You know what I mean? It was just kind of like, well, you got married to the right person, whoever that person was, and the right person was not necessarily the person you loved. So I don't know. There's a lot of social commentary there. There's a lot of religious commentary there. But it is interesting to see this shift of the Rusalki from being these kind of benevolent spirits that again, tricksterish in nature, because when we're dealing with nature spirits, it's not like we're trying to say, oh, nature spirits are automatically good, because they're not. That's the whole point. There's not this line between good and evil. They're not angelic or demonic beings. We don't have those kind of classifications. They're spirits of nature. They're liminal. They can swing either way. They're chaotic. Okay, in terms of their actions, they could help you, or they could kill you. I mean, it really, and that's true of nature in general, isn't it? I mean, this is how natural forces work. They can be a boon to you, and they may not be. But later on, this idea of these nature spirits now becoming some kind of a malevolent force that automatically leads to death, and that comes from this idea that death is somehow that is part of that corruption of the natural world, and that is what people have decided that means. As there's more of this the increasing move towards rationalizing things, thinking about things, and the way in which institutionalized religion comes into line with that. Okay, for example, with Protestantism, where you see that everything is not based on tradition or liturgy, but rather on scripture. It's the reading of the text that's important. The more we get involved in the words and thinking about the words and analyzing the words and doing all that, then we lose touch with what it means to be, to connect with those forces, yes, which are dangerous forces, but they're also, they're part of the forces that you negotiate as being a person who is alive in the world. And so this is about negotiating those, being able to properly negotiate those forces. But later on it becomes, no, these are simply things to be avoided and to stay away from. Or if you get involved with them, here's the bad thing that's going to happen to you. As speaking as somebody who has always been, what I call a fence jumper, I'm not somebody who, yes, you can stay within the nice, safe little confines of what you were raised with, but I would argue that you really don't get out there to experience life very much. You kind of end up living the same narratives over and over again, and they're probably not your narratives, probably somebody else's. And so to me, I'm like, well, then you really haven't lived your life. You've lived somebody else's version of what your life should be. Oh yeah, I didn't talk yet about the. I'm just looking at some of these notes that I have. The tickling death, which I thought this is just as a comment here. Now, of course, anybody who's ever been tickled or tickled severely, tickling is something that it's something that makes you laugh, but it also is something that can make your heart race. It can make you lose control of your body and body functions. I mean, it's interesting because it's something that somebody can do to going after your nervous system in such a way that you actually lose control of yourself. Okay. And so the idea that they tickle somebody to death, I find that's I find the suggestion that that this basically what the Rusalki are doing is they are making you lose control of yourself. So a lot of this is also about control and civilization and rational restraint, and how initially the Rusalki are something that you work with and that you bring gifts to, perhaps, or that you honor in some way. And again, apparently this does still go on in certain traditions, who honor them as these green-haired women who come out of the waters or who are in the trees, and but how that later on becomes something that is associated with maybe not even with hell, because when you're talking about someone who's unbaptized, you're talking about somebody who is like okay, the term that was often used was to go into limbo, which has never officially been part of certainly Catholic theology, but a lot of people believe in it. Oh, if you're unbaptized, you're not eligible to enter heaven, so you're left in this liminal in between space. So you become like one of these nature spirits. And, so you always have to kind of wander around on the earth. And why would you want to do that? Well, anyway, but you see this juxtaposition between, what was originally a benevolent force, associated with the fields and the waters. Again, different inflections in different parts of what we think of as Eastern Europe. But nonetheless, we still have the same rough basic concept surrounding them. They are definitely a nature spirit. They are associated with, the fertility. They are associated with the growth of the land, whether you see them as more part of the water or more part of the forest. And and the fact that later on that becomes a metaphor for something that is, somebody who is unsaved, somebody who is damned, somebody who is, like the ones who don't have the ferry money for Charon, who are kind of stuck in an in-between world. And because they are restless, they become harmful because of their restlessness. And that's a very, very old motif, the idea of the angry dead. So very interesting way in which, this kind of nature spirit morphs into this, malevolent kind of a being that, you have to watch out for, because whatever she leads you to, it will be death. And so it's worth stepping back and considering, what this says about our relationship to nature, especially if we're looking at the 19th century onward, where we're moving into a more rationalistic and eventually into a more mechanistic worldview, which is the one that we have today and the one we have a hard time getting outside of, and making it more difficult than ever, really, to connect. And it makes it for a long, tricky road back to being able to really fully reconnect with nature. Something I feel you can only do by you have to break that thought process. You have to break the taboo. You have to break the pattern. You have to break your conventional ideas about morality in some fashion. And for a lot of people, that doesn't happen unless something big happens to you in some way. It's one of the functions of initiation. Is that a real initiation is that whether somebody puts you through an initiation or whether somehow naturally you go through one through a circumstance, the idea is that it does traumatize you because it changes you. The idea is that it's meant to kind of smack out of you the whole modern notion of judgment and morality and ethics. Not to say that this makes you a wild and unethical, a wild person who, who's going to run off and, I don't know, go on killing sprees. And, it doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean morality in that sense. It just means all of these things about us as humans that we have learned to be ashamed of through this idea of tradition and morality that need to really be, we need to break the stranglehold on us. And a lot of that attempts to break that stranglehold is a lot of the struggle that we see now. Okay, that's about all I'm going to say on this subject. As always, I'm going to point you to Chthonia.net, which is my website, to see where all my content is. If you follow me on patreon.com/Chthonia, if you want to become a patron, I do provide extra podcasts. I do provide more updates. More looks at my work as things become available, and that before other people. And there is exclusive content on Patreon as well. And I'm trying to do more and more of that. And if you want to follow me on social media, I also update frequently on Instagram. I also use Facebook. Twitter, I tend to only use for when I'm actually posting the podcast, but nonetheless, you can follow me there. It's Chthonia Podcast. One word on Instagram and Twitter, and Chthonia Podcast, 2 words on Facebook. And of course, if you're listening to this on audio, I'm also just Chthonia on YouTube. Thanks so much for listening. Thank you so much to my awesome patrons, subscribers. Love you guys. And until the next time.